Okay, so Dr. Lillian Hunt, she, her, is the program lead for EDIS, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science and Health, a coalition of 17 organizations committed to collaborating to bring about positive change in the sector hosted and housed by Wellcome. Lillian received her PhD in genetics from UCL whilst at the Crick, and it was here that she helped bring together Wellcome, Francis Crick Institute, and GSK as founders of EDIS, and has developed and led the coalition to its recent expansion. Lillian runs the EDIS program of work, drawing on her research experience, together with the lived experience as a queer woman in science and EDI knowledge to drive an evidence-based approach to inclusion. Lillian has previously represented EDIS on the National Institute for Health Research's Involve Diversity and Inclusion Working Group, with a focus on inclusive patients and public involvement in health research, and champions inclusive research design and practice. Lillian has spoken extensively on the topics of diversity and inclusion in science and health research to a variety of audiences, notably for the Science Museum, the Social Innovation Exchange, and as part of the UN's He for She Arts Week. So I see there are a couple of people who have just joined since I started the introduction. This call is recorded, and if you have questions during the talk, just use the chat feature to submit those, and we'll get to those after the talk. Okay, thanks everyone. Over to you, Lily.
Thanks, Sean. And I will say it's even probably more uncomfortable to hear a bio being read about you, even on video chat. I didn't think that was quite possible, bearing in mind I always get sweaty palms when that happens in person. Thanks everyone for joining today. As mentioned, my name's Lillian Hunt, or Lily's absolutely fine. My pronouns are she and her. For anyone who's dialing in without video features, I'm a white woman with brunette hair, tied up in a ponytail at the moment, wearing a dark collared dress. So hopefully my internet will work today. I know a few people have been having issues on various different types of providers, but hopefully mine seems to be okay. And I wanted to talk to everyone really about sort of pride in a pandemic. We were in quite a unique situation this year, so I thought my sort of regular talk wouldn't quite suffice when it comes to pride and LGBT inclusion. So really wanted to sort of cover some sort of other things that we might need to be thinking about at the moment to help keep Virtual Pride Month going, and also about doing this while under this extraordinary global situation that we're currently facing. So just a little bit more background about me. So as mentioned, I'm the program lead for EDIS, which stands for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science and Health. We've got quite a sort of broad vision of everyone should have equal opportunities and access to a successful career within science and health, its research and its outcomes. So we're looking at it from a sort of holistic approach, not just the people who are doing the research, but the actual research itself and then who that benefits. Because we really understand this is a whole system that we work in. You know, no research is done in isolation, and therefore we need to think about it in its entirety. The mission for EDIS is to build a powerful, connected and coordinated movement. So that's why we're a coalition. That's why Sanger Institute, amongst many others, are members. And the impact statement that we work with is equal and better outcomes, which really ties in the business case for EDI. So we know equality, diversity and inclusion has a very strong moral case, but we also understand that the business case and the understanding that this impacts people in the long run is another way of getting people on board with this. So I just wanted to do a quick rundown of some of the members so you all know. So you've got the Academy of Medical Sciences, the Association for Medical Research Charities, AstraZeneca, Babraham Institute, Biochemical Society, Benevolent AI, the British Pharmacological Society, the Daphne Jackson Trust, EMBL EBI, the Elizabeth Blackwell Institute for Health Research at Bristol University, Francis Crick Institute, GSK, Physiological Society, Royal Society for Biology, Society for Applied Microbiology, Wellcome Trust, and then Genome Research Limited, well, SANG. So we have a really broad range of organisations that are involved, and our sort of idea is that not only can we facilitate better peer learning from each other, but we can also think about what is the next driving change that we're looking for, what is the leading sort of edge of EDI work, collaborate on those sort of goals collectively, and then hopefully by applying the same sort of vision across different types of organisations, we can create a bigger and more impactful change across the sector as a whole. So as mentioned, I'm housed within Wellcome Trust. I'm very thankfully sat within the diversity and inclusion team there, which is well resourced, and I'm very well supported therefore by welcomes legal team, welcomes finance teams, welcomes science teams as well. I just wanted to flag that we've changed our logo for Pride Month this year, as I'm sure many organisations have, but we've actually updated it from what we had last year as well. So we're now using the progress flag. And this builds on the usual Pride flag by adding stripes to emphasise groups within the LGBTQ plus community that also experience additional marginalisation, even from within the community itself. So trans and non-binary people represented by the white, pink and light blue stripes, and then LGBTQ plus people of colour represented by the brown and black stripes as well. There's also an additional stripe, so the black stripe can also double up for people who have died from AIDS or living with or have died from AIDS as well. So the progress flag is that next step across, and I think it's important that we start updating even as symbolic ideas as we update our understanding as well. So a little bit more about who am I. So as mentioned, I have a PhD in genetics. That's my main background within research. I'm cisgender. I was born assigned female at birth and still identify as a woman. I'm white. I'm a lesbian. I use the word queer to identify. I'm vegan because I have to mention that wherever I can go. And there's lots of other elements that make up who I am. When it comes to my sexual orientation and identity, I came out to some of my family at 16 and pretty much everyone by the time I was 19. So when I went to university at undergrad, I was pretty much out and proud as a gay woman. And I moved from sort of a small rural sort of area into London, where I did my undergrad at King's College London. What I didn't really realise at the time is that my identity was going to become a huge part of my career path, my aspirations for what I want to do, and also shape a lot of the way that I was looking at research being done as well in the world. So sort of that idea of not only is my identity important to me, but it's also important to the way I sort of work in the world and the things that I see as important. And I think actually a lot of the marginalization or harassment that I've faced as a queer woman has made me probably more aware and of understanding other people's experiences of that. And I think that leads to the sort of the idea of doing EDI within science and health research. In terms of sort of some of the basic stuff that I like to always include in some of my slides, is thinking about language. I mentioned LGBT, I mentioned LGBTQ+, but there's also LGBTQIAP+. There's so many letters that you could include in this acronym. Please don't be upset if I just default to LGBT or LGBTQ. I'm still trying to sort of improve including Q within my language. But please understand that I do include all sexual orientations and gender identities within the acronym when I'm talking about it. And you might see people using different ones in different ways. There's a lot of information on Stonewall's website about the different terms that can be used: lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, pansexual, as well as other identities too. So if you want to know more about the language that you can use, please have a look on that website as well. The other thing around sort of language, just tips that I always like to sort of ask people to do is just thinking around assumptions on people's sexual orientation. Try and avoid, don't ask people, do you have a boyfriend? Ask people, do you have a partner, for example. Don't treat people's sexual orientations as less appropriate to be mentioned in conversation just because it's not heteronormative. So heteronormative, thinking about heterosexual. So, there's nothing different about someone talking about a man as they would talking about their girlfriend. You can feel comfortable and confident asking the same sort of questions that you would ask. There's also other stuff around language I think is really important to know. Thinking about bisexual people, there's so many implications around people, or the way that people talk about bisexual or pansexual people, around, are people confused? Is it a mid-step? Can people like not make a decision? Bisexual and bi-erasure. Bi-erasure is a real problem in the community in terms of people not acknowledging bisexual as its own legitimate identity, and especially if someone is bisexual and in a what appears heterosexual relationship, often their identity is completely forgotten or not thought about. Please acknowledge this, and if you are looking at ways of supporting bisexual people, there is Bisexual Awareness Day. There are various resources out there about how to support bisexual friends and colleagues as well. I think that's really important. Something else that I'd like to bring up as well is, I'll go back to this last one quickly, just also things around It's not so much of a problem in adults, I find, as much, but definitely thinking about children and teenagers using the phrase "it's so gay" or "that's so gay" as sort of a negative. We can avoid that. We can pick that up every time. It shouldn't be controversial to put up anymore. If you hear someone saying it, please do just stop them from saying it. Ask them what they really mean is often the best first place, and then moving on to something else in terms of like another word for what they are actually describing, and acknowledging that by using gay, they're saying gay is a bad thing. I think this is really important. It's something that I always flag because I do a lot of volunteering going into schools, and most of my story is around the fact that I used to use that phrase when I was a kid and a teenager, and actually it led to loads of confusion and self-hatred when I eventually did realize that I was gay, because I had actually been saying it in such a negative and it was ingrained in me. So please, if you're working with children, teenagers, or have them, please flag that and pick that up when it happens. And then the other last one that I just wanted to also say is, which is something that I've heard recently amongst adults, gay marriage. I mean, we could just call it marriage rather than gay marriage. I guess you can say same-sex marriage if you really want to be explicit, but please, it's just marriage now. Like that we don't need to be explicit about saying it's different. It's the same. So I think it's time to move on with that language as well. Other things just to mention, you'll see at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned what my pronouns were, she and her. Really important that people start normalizing this behavior. Why would you assume that I'm a woman? You know, why would you assume that I identify in that way? You're making huge assumptions because of my appearance, and we all know that assumptions based on appearance are not a good place to start. So if people can use their pronouns, it normalizes that for those who currently might struggle to say what their pronouns are, first and foremost for fear of discrimination or for it being different to how they present themselves as well. So she, her, he, him, they, them. There are other pronouns obviously out there for gender neutral terms or non-binary people as well. But if you can add them to your email signature, just a little bit in brackets, that's always a really good step as well. I just want a quick note on intersectionality as well. I'll come back to that a bit later, but I think it's really important to remember, like when I was talking about who am I earlier, I am no one thing in isolation, and I am a result of intersections of various parts of my identity, and all of those come with power dynamics in society. So understanding where I have privilege, understanding where I might be slightly disadvantaged, but knowing that all of those interact with each other, I think is really important, especially in the queer community. And using the word queer. So like I said, I use the word queer. There are other words that the LGBTQ community have tried to reclaim or are reclaiming individually. So I will use the word queer. I will not use the other words that are on this slide. Personally, I don't feel comfortable using them about myself or about others, but I know that there are people in the community who do, and they feel empowered by doing that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is an individual choice. Those outside the community just for these words realistically, unless someone tells them that they can use these words to describe them. I think queer is probably the one that's starting to move the mainstream a little more, but reality is words are important, words bring us power, and words empower us when we can use them the way that we want to use them rather than have them used against us. And I think it's really important to understand that people's journeys are different for these, and there should be a utmost respect for how people decide to use these words, especially from within the community themselves. So this is a really good article which shows a bit of a personal perspective from someone about reclaiming sort of anti-LGBTQ slurs and how those are used. But I just think it's something when we talk about language to really sort of acknowledge. So that's my broad sort of introduction that I thought I would include. But now I guess a little bit is thinking about, okay, LGBTQ community within STEM, I think is also something that we should talk about. So there aren't that many studies out there about LGBTQ experiences within the sciences. There are plenty of anecdotes. I could probably drum up about 10 people to tell you about their experiences of homophobia or transphobia within science research. And I could probably also drum up probably 10 people who haven't explicitly experienced this either. So we don't really know too much as a whole. Where there have been studies, there's lots of thoughts around the way that your identity in society interacts with your career choice, for example. So this is one study that was talking about coming out in STEM and factors affecting retention of sexual minority STEM students. It was based in America, and essentially that they were looking at the number of STEM students who were not heterosexual versus their heterosexual counterparts, and the likelihood of them continuing their studies and continuing through into STEM careers. And they actually found that there was lesbian, gay, bisexual and queer students were less likely to be retained in STEM. And they also sort of normalize this against other factors, so sort of making sure that people were measured against the same sort of attainment rate, the same educational background, things like that as well, and still found that there was this difference was there. This difference is also larger than just for gender as well. So we talk a lot about gender problems within STEM, about women's retention of the women's pipeline and things like that, and the broken pipeline, but we actually have a little bit of research that says actually sexual identity could also be quite a big factor, and if not the same, maybe even more in some instances. What's interesting is there's also a lot of talk around how stereotypes affect these as well. So there's lots of chat, and there's a couple of sort of studies thinking about how women who are queer following STEM paths might be more likely to be retained than men who are queer following STEM paths as a result of STEM still coming under this sort of gendered stereotypical approach and the way that it's seen in society. So there's loads of really interesting social commentary around that and social research thinking about that. The problem is we just don't unpick it enough, because actually there aren't that many places that properly record someone's sexual orientation through from education all the way through into their careers and then following their career path. Sexual orientation is a protected characteristic by the UK Equality Act. So we are able to look at it in order to then look for, see if there is any discrimination or barriers. And we could probably do a lot better job at that. There is one study that was released, I think it was last year, that was done in the physical sciences specifically. So this was run by the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Institute of Physics. The Institute of Physics have got a really good program around LGBT inclusion, as well as looking at discrimination. And what they did find is specifically within the physical sciences that there was exclusionary behaviour, that there were lacking policies, that there was a lack of awareness, and also that there were necessarily LGBT plus networks everywhere as well. And I thought the quote that they have in here, ultimately what any minority group belonging person wants is, when push comes to shove, will my organisation support me? And I think that's really important, because it doesn't just fit for the LGBTQ community, but it's also for all minoritized people. I think that idea of, will someone support me? If someone does do something that is harassing behavior or is abusive behavior or is discriminatory behavior because of my identity, whatever that is, will my organization support me? And also, will my organization empower minoritized groups as well? So you've got to remember, if you are coming from a group that is an actual minority, as in your numbers are lower, but also is a power minority, so where, for example, BAME groups are the global majority, but most of the time they're in the minority within workplaces. How do we bring their voices up to the foreground when there's less people to make noise? And I think that's something where you have to think about where your power sits and where you can share your power as well. And I think it's the same, for example, the queer community. Let's have a queer community within your workplace, and there are very few people there. These are still important, and they don't have the same people to talk about it. So you have space, and you have to sort of distribute power. Something that I also want to talk about then in the workplace is networks and staff networks. So staff networks are really important. When I did my PhD at the Crick, I founded an LGBTQ plus network there, and I founded it with a friend because we were moving into the Crick from different buildings, from all of the legacy sites, and we thought it was important to then create this network so that we could sort of support each other, especially moving into central London. And it turns out that it was a much needed group. There were a lot of people, especially international people, who were moving into London who didn't know where to find communities of support, who were moving across, for example, without necessarily like friends or families as well. And it was just building that sense of community that we really needed at the time. At the same time, obviously, that with EDIS, we talk about LGBT networks here as well, and we want to sort of link up the LGBTQ networks that exist across different organisations, but also where an organisation isn't particularly large, so therefore might not have enough people to create a network. It would be great to sort of link up other societies, for example, together to create a sort of a wider LGBTQ network amongst the science and health field. And the same for Wellcome Trust. So Wellcome Trust also has a really, really well functioning LGBTQ plus network, which not only supports staff, runs events, launches, runs walks in Pride, but also is now fundamental to the way that policies and practices at Wellcome are looked at. So pretty much every time something, a new policy gets brought in that is affecting people, they'll often go to the staff networks, including the LGBT network, back and input as well, understanding that the lived experience of someone who's queer will be different from someone who's not, and therefore the policy might work differently for them. One of the things that comes with this though, and it's something that I'm quite happy to do these talks and to talk to people and be out and queer and you know, tell everyone in the world that I'm a lesbian, that's no problem, but don't expect people to do that if they are gay or if they are LGBTQ plus. Being out at work can often feel like there's an expectation to be a role model or a face for people to recognize and feel comfortable around, or someone to support others who might be maybe earlier in their journey to coming out. And it's kind of feels even more extreme in science when the number of notable queer scientists appears limited. I mean, the number of notable queer scientists might be a lot higher because a lot of people's work has either been overlooked or there's been queer erasure throughout history. But it ends up being this sort of chicken and egg concept where it's like, I can't see anyone who I can relate to, so I therefore don't want to put myself out there because I don't know how I'll be accepted or how I'll be received. But then there are no people who look or who you can relate to out there. So you kind of have to decide whether you make that jump into being a role model and whether or not you make that jump into being visible. It's kind of funny, I've always just assumed that people now know that I'm gay because of the number of these talks I've done, the number of rainbow badges that I wear, the number of times that I've spoken about being gay and sort of just generally use it in conversation. But we'd had an EDIS symposium last September and I gave a part of the talk around the inclusion of the event. And when I was looking through the feedback forms afterwards, someone had written that they were upset that there was no LGBTQ plus representation amongst the speakers. And at that point I realized I hadn't actually said I was gay. I thought I just assumed that everyone kind of knew by that point. However, I hadn't said it, and therefore they decided that there were no queer speakers at all. And it's kind of this weird one where you go, I understand why you want to have that representation in a talk, but for being a queer person, like, we decide when we come out or not most of the time. You know, it's not, at least for me, being cisgender as well and cis passing and being straight passing as well, I'm relatively femme, I guess it's not something that necessarily everyone does think of straight away. So I kind of now feel quite a strong responsibility to mention it whenever I do give a talk, and I don't know if I don't think everyone would feel comfortable doing that. And also, if I give a talk about like my science, mentioning I'm gay at the beginning feels really weird because it's not, you know, it's not what I'm talking about. So there's this sort of complex decision making that's going on at the beginning, where you kind of have to decide whether or not you make a thing of it or not, but you know that it's probably going to help someone out there. But then, like, why should you have to do that? And again, I think it's genuinely because there is just this complete sort of erasure of people's identities or making a big deal about it. So for example, if you go on someone's Wikipedia page, pretty much every celebrity Wikipedia page talks about their personal life, but every gay celebrity Wikipedia page has a little section about being gay. And I kind of want to just go back to all of the other celebrity Wikipedia pages. And there was a great tweet that I saw about, can we edit them so they all say presumed straight? Because you don't have to evidence being straight, but you have to evidence being gay on Wikipedia. And you kind of end up with vision of everyone else being sort of normal, and then you have an extra section when you're in the LGBT community talking specifically about that. And it kind of just like means that this whole process of coming out continually still happens every day. Now, I will say though, that whoever whoever goes first in an organization, whoever is brave enough to step up and say, yep, I'm gay, I'm queer, I'm trans, and be open about it, that person should always be hugely applauded, because without someone else there to be that role model for them, they have taken a huge leap of faith. And this is why I think it's really important that organizations, even when they don't have queer role models that they know of in their organization, or they don't have a staff network yet, they need to talk about support for LGBTQ staff. They need to open up policies so they're gender neutral. They need to talk about, you know, parents and carers and families in a diverse manner. They can be consisting of any type of individual, any type of group of people, and therefore you're creating that safe space in advance. This shouldn't be a reactionary thing. Organizations really need to sort of step up in advance of their staff coming to them for help. You know, the help should already be there. I've spoken a lot about coming out at work at this point, and I guess this is one of the things that I want to think about, which is like, why does it matter to come out at work? So the way I see it is that the amount of mental capacity it takes for someone to hide who they are in the workplace can easily become overwhelming and exhausting, especially in a negative environment, but also in a neutral environment where there's unknowns. You don't have to necessarily think that the environment around you is going to be full of backlash, but that unsure and not having the clarity is also exhausting. So imagine this incredibly scientific image that I've got here. Well, this is your mind, and this is you thinking about hiding your identity. And every time you get where you would just answer in a regular, normal way, you have to make a decision of whether you come out or not, because you will be surprised how many times people mention their children, their family, their friends, their partner. Even a simple question like, what did you get up to this weekend? You have to make a decision at that point, if you're not out, as to whether you do say that you were with your partner at a queer community centre or just gone shopping, you know. And that sort of decision and those quick decisions that you have to make build up across a day. When you do that, your sort of thoughts race through your mind. And I've kind of described it once to a straight friend of mine, which is when I kind of go in a room with new people, it's not so much now, because I think, you know, if anyone can find my Twitter, they know that there's a million things to indicate I'm gay. But outside of that, you know, if you go into a room, you've got to decide, do I feel safe coming out in this room? Do I feel safe mentioning these things? Will people react to me to this? Will people in the same way? Will people, if I say that I am gay, you know, will people, why did you have to mention your wife? Why did you have to mention your, you know, partner? And it's a lot. It's not going through your brain at that moment. And like I said, it can be exhausting. Now, I think we can all agree that a scientist's brain is better put to use thinking about science rather than having to go through this whole process every time they talk to someone. So if you can create an environment that is open and welcoming, supportive, and quite clearly happy with all forms of diversity, then that person doesn't have to juggle in their head who they have and haven't told about their wedding, adoption, anything else that might help them. And they can just get on with being themselves, being free, and then putting their mind to great use for science, which I think is our little business case that we get to tack on to the end of this for LGBT inclusion in science. Now, what I wanted to talk about is how this relates also to the pandemic situation. Now, I'm talking to you right now from my bedroom, and I know I was with people talking from their kids' bedrooms, from their living room. We are in a situation where your life is no longer as private as it was. We have had windows into each other's worlds. Even with virtual backgrounds, someone can interrupt a call with an emergency, and you just have to deal with that. You probably have to mention it to the person that you're speaking to. We know more detail about people's partners and children and families, their home environments, who they live with, who they don't live with, and they are coming up in conversation, whether that's casual coffees over like virtual coffees, or actually just as part of that preamble before you go into something. The option of holding back personal elements of your life is super restricted. So if you aren't out at work yet, and now you're put in this situation here where you have all of this going on in the background, you're trying to juggle this at home as well as being whether or not you say something in person to someone, you might have to come out, and you might not feel ready at that point either. The choice kind of isn't there in the same way as well. So there's all of these extra elements of difficulty to sort of acknowledge and understand could be quite hard to talk about. So the best thing, realistically, is if you're in a position where someone is coming out to you in some way or another, whether that's directly or whether that's sort of just mentioning a partner that they've not mentioned before, your reaction is to just be normal about it. And I think this is something that I've heard from someone before where they said, you know, this is their first time being video calling from home, and they mentioned that their boyfriend just bought them a cup of tea during a call because they were like, well, I might as well do it now. And the people in the video call, you had two people who were like, oh my God, boyfriend, why didn't you ever say this? No, just act normal. It's like, it's completely normal now. It's not, you don't need to make a big deal about it. And actually that made them more uncomfortable with the fact that they had been asked why hadn't they done it before and things like that. And it's just an additional layer of complexity that I think we need to consider with our colleagues especially. And I said I'll talk a little bit more about sort of this idea of LGBTQ in a pandemic and sort of some of the additional problems that the community might be facing that you might not have thought about, or that might not be affecting people outside the community as much. Excuse me. So the first one's really thinking about accessing healthcare and medication. I think we all know that there's been some instability in terms of who can get medication, how quickly for various things. Got to remember in the LGBTQ plus community, we've got a high number of people using PrEP or PEP, and also hormonal replacement treatments as well. All of these have been pressured in this current pandemic. And also in addition to that, with coronavirus and with the ideas with self-isolation, when you have symptoms, if you have to have someone else come and pick up your medication as well, you've got to have sort of those trusted people, because a lot of the time they're coming from specialist clinics and things like that as well. In addition, we do have quite a high immunocompromised group of the community. There is a fear of catching the virus, obviously, if you're going to go and seek treatment for other things as well. So that additional pressure and that additional stress of catching COVID-19, I think, is also prevalent in the community. Hostile home environments, and this is something that I think is also true for other people, but particularly for young people. If you live with a LGBT phobic family and you don't have anywhere else to go because you're not independent, you are stuck in that environment, and you have been stuck there for 3 months. So there's been an increase of use in support lines and for LGBTQ youth in the current pandemic as well. And that hostile environment, that could just be that someone can't be themselves at home, which, believe me, I went back in the closet for a year once in a particular environment, and I was out for the rest of my life in that sort of same year time frame. And actually being back in a closet for a portion of your life, having already had the freedom of being out, is really hard, and it is really, really severely damaging in terms of your mental health. And I think it's something that we have to acknowledge, that there are people who might have been out with most of their community, with most of their friends, and they're now being put back in the closet essentially to have a more calm and stable home life, despite wanting to be free and who they are. Another one is around loneliness and isolation. Community is really essential for the LGBT community, and particular older people as well. So we are still in the generation where there are many LGBTQ people in the older generations who have gone through life with laws preventing them from having families. So actually there are less people around them in their support groups. They will have gone potentially through the epidemic as well and lost a lot of their community prior to that moment as well. So actually loneliness and isolation is a huge problem in the older LGBTQ plus community anyway. Add into that self-isolation and a COVID pandemic, and we're seeing even more use and need for support lines and for support groups sort of virtually for our community. In addition, LGBT people in general are more likely to have, that is a piece of health research that has been done anyway. So I know that many of my friends anyway have felt that this pandemic and this isolation has been tough, and I think that you know, if you already are having poor mental health, this is just another thing to add onto that list. Homelessness and insecure housing. So actually LGBT communities are more likely to be homeless or insecurely housed as a whole. Again, another national survey. So add into that sort of during this pandemic and how that's affected our homeless population, I think is really something that we have to recognise as a problem in how we help and support homelessness and insecure housing in our community. And then the last one around backlash and public opinion. So you'll see that actually, you know, there's been quite a lot of transphobic commentary online recently. And I think people need to see that this is almost exclusively aimed at trans women. So it is not justified in any way. No hate is ever justified. But it's even more ridiculous that this hate is going just towards our trans women in our community. And people are using this as a platform for all sorts of other hate speech. And I think it's really hard if you're already in a precarious situation, in insecure housing, already struggling with access to your healthcare and medication, to then see a vitriol of hate online against you. It's horrendous, and we have to stand with our trans sisters and acknowledge that actually they are facing the brunt of this backlash as well. And then just in general sort of public opinion and discrimination, you know, we're moving on with COVID-19 treatments, and we're looking at, for example, platelet donations for COVID trials and blood donations. Men who have sex with men are still being given a no whether they want to donate platelets and blood unless they have waited 3 months after having either oral or anal sex with another man before donating. And it doesn't matter if they're in a committed relationship or not. It doesn't matter if they're using protection or not, PrEP or not, or anything like that. And it's still a ridiculous rule. And it means that our community who want to support and we want to help aren't being allowed to in the same way that our straight counterparts are, or even our lesbian women in our community are. So there are lots of little things that are coming through with this that are causing problems for our community. And what I did want to know is actually, I personally have found that when I have been out with my partner, I've personally experienced more misogyny and homophobia than I normally have in terms of catcalling and people in the street. And that's just a personal anecdote, and it's unacceptable, basically. And I think that it's going to be a lot more thought about what pressures this pandemic has led to in terms of additional discrimination and harassment that's faced by other people. Now, the LGBT Foundation has a really good briefing on how COVID-19 has impacted the community. So I really do recommend having a look at that if you are interested. So next bit to talk about was what we're doing for Pride 2020 realistically, and also acknowledge this. Across history, pandemics have been powerful engines of social change, exposing inequalities in distribution of health and wealth. COVID-19 has been no different, and it's apparent to us all that while the virus might not discriminate, health systems, housing systems, and employment do. And all of those things have got intersectional power dynamics with various identities. And as a whole, has stepped up very well in response to the highlighting of systemic racism amongst both the UK. We need to make sure that we as a community act as activists as much as possible. So Pride 2020, how to Pride when you need to be socially distant. I'm going to just try and do this quickly because I know that we're now. So first one, for example, launching a trans inclusion policy online. So this is what the Wellcome Trust have done this Pride month. So this has been a couple of years in the making, but it's a really good comprehensive policy to support our trans colleagues, both in their transition, but also coming out as trans at work. There's a policy, but there's also guidance, which also shows how managers and colleagues can support their colleagues as well. This is a really great step, and I hope that more organisations look to creating these policies and guidance. Other things we can do online, we can revisit our roots. So as much as Pride Month, people keep wishing Happy Pride, it doesn't feel right in its entirety to say Happy Pride all the time, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement surging around the globe. Pride previously, I think, has been focused far too much on the glittery commercialization, and actually maybe we can go back to our roots a little bit of the activism that really sort of was the start of Pride. So original Stonewall riots and how Pride came to be, I think, is really important. The LGBTQ plus community not only includes the Black community, but we owe a lot to Black communities, to the Black, queer, intersex, trans, and people of colour, for the surgence of these rights. You know, Pride in its first instance was a riot, And I think a lot of people are going back to that language and really understanding how social change happened off the back of that. Other things, thinking about getting intersectional. So Black Trans Lives Matter is coming through as well within the Black Lives Matter movement. There's no point saying Black Lives Matter if we don't include all Black lives amongst that. And Black trans people are still being persecuted, specifically not only within their community, within our community, within the global situation as well. Make Pride accessible. So we've got an opportunity here online to really think about ableism within the LGBTQ+ community. Pride generally hasn't been that accessible, I don't think. There's been lots of stories online about how people who wanted to attend Pride with various, for example, mobility issues, been put in separate areas that don't have access to stage, can't see the sort of the parade when it's going on, things like that. Same for pubs, clubs and bars. When they eventually reopen, if they haven't thought about accessibility, they're losing out on a whole section of clientele. We're doing things online now. Things seem more accessible. How much of that can we take forward when we're going through? This is being recorded, so thankfully all of this will be available for everyone, but learn, sign, share, donate. There's lots of stuff you can do for activism online. You can be reading, you can be learning about history, you can be learning about current events, you can be supporting the current calls for LGBT conversion therapy to be banned in the UK, which it still hasn't been banned yet. There's the Gender Recognition Act that's we did a public consultation through. There was 70% positive support on that, and yet we're hearing that the government's probably not going to go ahead with it. There are charities you can donate to and that you can support, that you can volunteer with as well when we get to the other side of this. And also, don't forget, you can still celebrate. So Pride Inside is being run online with UK Black Pride, Amnesty International, Stonewall and Para Pride as well. All of those great organisations, and they're going to be showcasing diversity of talents. And Global Pride will be streaming 24 hours of content that reflects and celebrates the diversity of LGBTQ+ people everywhere. So put those energies and time into these, stay connected with your communities as well. And just remember, no justice, no pride. Could this be the most authentic Pride? Depending on how we approach this, quite possibly. We'll see whether brands continue their same messaging that they normally do each year when we're now unable to go spend money in their shops. So with that, I think I want to say thank you, and happy to take any questions that have come in the chat, or if you want to put any more in there, feel free to email me on either of those emails. EDIS Group's Twitter's on there, and my personal one's on there as well, but expect a lot of weird gifs and memes if you go on that one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily, for such an interesting talk. So there were a couple of questions that came in through the chat. So let's go through some of those first, and then people, if they still have questions, you can send them through the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom and we can get to those. So someone pointed out, HC, that quilt bag could be a good alternative to represent the movement and avoids the alphabet soup. Have you got any thoughts about ways to make the entire possibility of letters easier to remember?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think I think someone wrote out all the letters once, and they could get to something like in the teens or even in the 20s of letters that you could possibly use. So I think, to be honest, I personally think, and this is complete personal opinion, that over time we will reclaim the word queer almost in its entirety, and we will probably start using queer community more than LGBT. But I think that's some time going, but I think that's where we might end up. That's my sort of take on it. I think the acronyms worked, and actually we need to almost keep the acronym for a little bit longer, especially as there's transphobia even within the queer community. So LGB with the T is very important. And so I think we'll keep them for a bit longer, but I can see us moving away from it and just probably going to end up reclaiming the word queer over the next sort of maybe 2 generations, I'd say.
And Rachel mentioned that it really bothers her when she sees headlines talking about the first ever gay or LGBTQ or trans person receive a particular award or accomplishment, and that it bugs her because it contributes to erasure. Do you have any more thoughts about that kind of erasure?
Yeah, I think it's really important that the agency for whether someone wants to be the first queer person to do something comes from that person. So, for example, let's say in a weird parallel world, I won a Nobel Prize. I don't know if I would want my sexual orientation to be added into that because of what the prize is for. However, I would quite happily do interviews where I would then mention that I was queer as well, and make sure that people did know, so that, for example, if a young queer version of me saw that, they could go, oh, I could win a Nobel Prize too. I completely agree. Like, I think doing that is so hard. Also, in addition, we have no idea what people's sexual orientations were throughout history in most cases. There are so many examples of women who lived with their best friends through the Victorian period, for example, who quite probably, I'm not going to say definitely because I'm not going to put any words in anyone's mouth, but even my great aunt had a very close female friend who she lived with for almost her entire life. And now looking back over the photos and the letters that I've been given through sort of my family, I'm kind of raising these flags going, is no one else seeing this? Like, this isn't what you think it is, but it's definitely different. So there's all that erasure of like how many people previously might have actually been from the community that we just don't know about. I think it's really important though that we do acknowledge where we have consent, that people are queer and they are succeeding, so that we can have those examples and eventually normalize it. Basically, I think that those two kind of come together.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially especially in academia, and I think STEM particularly. There's definitely more of an emphasis on, oh, it's only your science that matters, home life is separate. So it's really interesting points about, you know, whether that should be mentioned or not and what prominence should be given. So Alexi asked, are there any further thoughts about overcoming the fear of remote working, meaning our colleagues see more of our private lives? Even the mental burden of what did you do this weekend feels huge.
Yeah. I think, so the biggest thing for that is kind of, I know it's hard to do over video, but being very aware of whether it sounds like someone wants to talk more or doesn't want to talk more. So you kind of have this little open space where someone could say something about their weekend or about what they, you know, have been up to or about their family. But if their answer is short, you kind of also don't make a deal about that and move on. You know, give that space, but it's really up to that, like, a person whether or not they want to say something. The thing I will say though is, like, the more you talk about all forms of diversity, the more people will feel more confident mentioning their own characteristics, their own identities, their own families, things like that. You know, if you have kids, you know, it'll be really interesting if you read them a book that includes families of different types. You mention the title of that book when you're updating about what you've been up to that weekend, and already you've created what seems like a safe space. So, you know, if I were to hear someone say something like that about what they've been up to with their kids, I immediately know that that person has not only thought about other identities, but also accepts and wants to educate their own families on them. So, you know, things like that, if there's ways of doing that, I think that would be amazing. The other thing, yeah, like I said, the other thing is just, yeah, making sure that people have the agency to not say stuff if they don't want to as well. Virtual backgrounds are great, and I see Alexi's got a fantastic virtual background right now, but that still doesn't stop the idea of whether or not someone's going to interrupt you. And I think, yeah, just being conscious of it, I think, is really important. I do also have a question that's come in to me as well, talking about me freely using the words queer and straight, and whether or not they're still seen offensive by sort of the hetero community. So generally, I personally still think that, so for me personally, I define myself, including others sort of in my community, I use the word queer. I know others who don't like using that word, and I would personally say that for a straight person or someone who's not in the LGBTQ plus community, to avoid it for now. I think it will change, but I think for now your best option is to just avoid. I wouldn't be offended if someone described me as queer, that's for sure, but I've also told everyone that. So I think the assumption should be to not use it unless you've been given the word to use by someone else.
So there's a great comment actually by Bertu, I think is how it's pronounced, who mentioned that they were watching it with their daughter, and we're interested in if you, as part of EDIS, do any work with schools at Welcome.
So I don't with EDIS or Welcome with Schools, but I do with the charity diversity role models. So we go into schools and we have, so we volunteer as role models. We have a facilitator who talks about homophobic, biphobic or transphobic bullying if it's to a secondary school, or we have a facilitator who talks about different types of families if we go into primary schools. And then we'll have one or two of us role models come in and talk about sort of our experiences, who we are and things like that. And again, it talks about assumptions. And actually, if you give me 1 second, I've got a fantastic book that I will also show you. Yeah, 1 second. Now you are seeing a full into my home life. So this is Goldilocks and the Five Bear Families, which is a book by Ollie Pike, and Ollie Pike does other books as well. And also does an online YouTube channel that's really good, that talks about different families, different dynamics and different people, and generally how to get the idea of kids accepting different types of kids also through, and really recommend that. So I've bought that. So my sister's due date is today, and when her baby is born, this book will be read to the baby whenever it's growing up, as part of my education of babies, of kind of coming out to my niece or nephew, basically, and normalising that. So I really recommend Ollie Pike.
Oh, it's a great suggestion. And if anyone else is interested in the LGBT in schools approach, the network is having a talk on the 30th of June by the Fusion Group from Birchwood High School's Equality and Diversity Group. So come along to that too. Does anyone else have any questions for Lily?
And so I will share the, I can share the slides, I think, because I think a lot of the stuff I've got the links to as well. So there'll be links for all of, I think, charities, the Pride celebrations, some of the background between lots of things as well. So another sort of question that came through as well was recommending someone who might be confused about their identity, where can they talk things through privately with? So there are, I mentioned that I think is a, let me see if I can, am I still screen sharing, aren't I? Yeah. So in the charities at the bottom, the Switchboard LGBT+ helpline is really good and has been running for a really long time. And I think it's a really good place to start. It's also, if there's anyone who would want to, I think Kaleidoscope Trust also potentially have a helpline too, but I think the Switchboard is a really great starting point, and I often support them with the work that they do as much as I can personally. So I think that's a really good place to start for talking things through. Other options are always going to be if there's a close friend or ally that you really trust. I think that's also a brilliant place to talk to someone as well. Same for network and things like that. So yeah, really recommend those as options if there's any sort of things that you want to talk through about identity, about belonging, as well as sort of how to approach that next step.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just campus specifically, for the Genome campus on our intranet page for the network, there are a couple of our emails for us as individuals. They don't go to the whole network, for people who are seeking support or need to reach out to someone on a more private level. Yeah,
definitely. I think if you've got an LGBT network on campus or in an organisation, I know when I was at the CRIC, for example, when I was chair there, I would sometimes get emails through about someone wanting to just talk through their own identity or how they might want to come out to people, things like that, in a confidential and private way. Generally, chairs will sign up when they become chair of a network at staff network to say that they're happy to have those conversations in complete confidence. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lily. We're coming up to time. So I just want to thank everyone for coming along. And thank you for an excellent talk, Lee.
No problem. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And like I said, feel free to email me if you've got any questions or want any more information.